Robert Hill's my name. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of the United States Studies Centre to this event, which is an occasion to hear from a very distinguished American and, more importantly, an opportunity to actually interchange with him on the subject that he's going to address. Our guest is Dennis C. Blair. Admiral Blair serves as a member of the Energy Security Leadership Council of Securing America's Future Energy, on the boards of Freedom House, the National Bureau of Asian Research, and the National Committee on US-China Relations. He's a member of the Aspen Homeland Security Council. From January 2009 to 2010, as Director of National Intelligence, Director Blair led 16 national intelligence agencies, administering a budget of $50 billion and providing integrated intelligence support to the President, Congress, and operations in the field. Just by comparison, when I had the privilege to be Australia's Defence Minister, I think our total budget was $14 billion, about a third of what our guest had for his intelligence purposes. From 2003 to 2006, Dennis Blair was President and Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Defence Analysis, a federally funded research and development centre based in Alexandria, Virginia, that supports the Department of Defence, the Department of Homeland Security, and the intelligence community. Prior to retiring from the Navy in 2002, Admiral Blair served as Commander-in-Chief, US Pacific Command, the largest of the combatant commands of the United States, which of course includes not only the naval forces but air forces, Marines, and Army. During his 34-year Navy career, Admiral Blair served on guided missile destroyers in both the Atlantic and Pacific fleets and commanded the Kitty Hawk battle group. Ashore, he served as Director of the Joint Staff and held budget and policy positions on the National Security Council and several major Navy staffs. A graduate of the US Naval Academy, Admiral Blair earned a master's degree in History and Languages from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He was also a White House Fellow at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. He's been awarded 4 Defence Distinguished Service Medals, 3 National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medals, and has received decorations from the governments of Australia, Thailand, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Australia, where he's an honorary officer of the Order of Australia. We're very pleased to have someone with such a very distinguished career to talk to us today, and there's probably nobody better who could address the subject that we have before him, which is prospects for peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific region. So I'm going to invite Admiral Blair to address us. I will then have the opportunity to ask him a few questions, and then I want to draw you into the discussion with a series of questions and from the floor, and I will sum up just before 6:30. So can we all join together and welcome Admiral Blair.
Well, thanks very much, Robert. I think the chances for peace and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region are pretty good. Any questions? I guess I better explain myself a little bit since I'm in an academic setting and need to provide a little bit of background on that. But it is good to be here at Sydney University. My son is an alumnus of this fine institution, and so it has a special place in my heart. I don't know quite where my body clock is. I've been here about 4 days, and so that helps. On the other hand, trying to cheer the U.S. basketball team onto its gold medal at 2 o'clock in the morning has hurt a little bit. So if I fall asleep partway through, please wake me up. and don't set an example by falling asleep in the back row that I might try to emulate. But I have been in Australia long enough to get a good sense from Australia's point of view of this central question of where is the security and the economic and the overall situation going in Eastern Asia, and to sense this conflict that many Australians feel they are in between their traditional alliance with the United States, which has yielded a pretty good 60 or 70 years since the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the newly emerging relationship with China, primarily economically based, but not entirely, with a lot of questions about how China will develop, how relationships between China and the United States will develop, and how the general developments in the region will go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that subject, which I've been involved in various parts of over the years, and then I do want to turn it into a dialogue, not just a lecture in fairly short order. The one sort of document that's sort of been thrown into this fray is a book been written recently by Hugh White, who served in the government at an early stage, and wrote a pretty provocative book about what he thought about the U.S.-China relationship and the implications for Australia. And it was a book, I think, designed to raise those issues, and I certainly applaud Hugh for writing it and for taking the trouble over several hundred pages to lay out his rationale for his conclusions. But I'd like to tell you this afternoon why I disagree with a lot of the way Hugh approaches the problem, and try to give you a context for the things I think that we need to watch and to work on in having things come out well here in this part of the part of the world. I guess the main objection I have to the way the future of East Asia is presented in this book is this emphasis on the word primacy, something that the United States had in this part of the world for many years, something that China wants, and something that the United States has three choices for dealing with. We either abandon it, we share it, or we try to maintain it. And then all of the other logic in this book sort of goes off from those three basic choices. Well, I think it's really sort of a simplified notion, this primacy notion, and I believe that the situation is much more complex than that the reality of international relations here in the 21st century and going forward is much more textured and complex than that. And if we allow international relations to simply be defined in terms of great power, spheres of influence, and who's number one and who's number two and who's number three, we're really going back to a simpler and I think outdated way of thinking about relations among states. And I think that if we allow our thinking to go back that way, we really disastrously oversimplify the reality of what's going on here in East Asia, and we diminish our chances for having a successful future in which we can all share the benefits, and which we can minimize the chances of conflict and bad things happening to all of us. So let's talk about this idea of primacy. I can tell you, as one who had senior American positions during this period of our supposed primacy, it didn't really feel like we had repealed the laws of physics and could beckon our finger anywhere in this part of the world and things would happen that we wanted to happen. It was a much more difficult world than that. During the 1980s, Japan was challenging the United States economically, and it was winning. Japanese were taking huge market share. There was a feeling that Japan was going to become the most economically prosperous and most powerful country in the region. In the late 1990s, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, was faced by China with a series of territorial claims in the South China Sea. There were disputes over outposts, detachment of soldiers, rotations of ships would go out to these outposts. It looked a lot like what we've seen over the last several months, last couple of years in the South China Sea. And that phase ended happily in 2002 with China and the other countries who had disputes in the South China Sea signing something called the Code of Conduct for the South China Sea, which set out a good series of approaches to the problem, to handle it peacefully, to handle it diplomatically, which held for about 10 years until we went into the current round. In 1990 or so, the Philippines told the United States that it was time to leave two large bases, which we had operated from for years and years at great expense and a great strategic advantage, and the United States left. We departed. A couple of years ago, China told North Korea in very clear terms that it didn't want North Korea to develop nuclear weapons. In particular, it didn't want North Korea to test a nuclear weapon, and it made it quite clear what its desires were. A couple of months later, North Korea went ahead and tested a nuclear weapon. A couple of months after that, China provided a lot of food, concrete, and other supplies to North Korea. And the point is that the big countries don't seem to be able to have their way with the small countries in this region on a routine basis. Certainly didn't happen during this period of so-called U.S. hegemony, U.S. primacy. Didn't happen for the U.S., didn't happen for Japan, didn't happen for China. So this idea that if you have this thing called primacy, you can automatically call the tune in this part of the world and everybody else dances once you name what it is simply not true in my experience. And to think of the world in terms of primacy, concerts of power, spheres of influence is not only correct, but is, I think, leads us down false paths, which will not lead to good endings in this part of the world. In fact, the advice that comes out of Hugh White's book was in a different form, was offered to me by a Chinese interlocutor, a senior Chinese retired official a few years ago. We'd had a few Mao Tais, and he said, only half in jest, I tell you what, you give us Taiwan, we'll give you North Korea. That ought to solve the problem. And basically, this thesis of concerts of power and spheres of influence really wants to reduce all of this complexity of East Asia into this single geographic military balance, to draw lines. I run everything on this side of it, you run everything on that side of it, that's the deal. And I think that it's not the right way to approach it. Joseph Nye, who many of you know has a deep interest in Asia and in the world in general, has described a much more sophisticated concept of power in the 21st century, and the description of it that he gives in his latest book is called smart power. You recall that he wrote an earlier book talking about soft power, contrasting it to hard power, and he's really expanded that concept into smart power, and it includes a large number of dimensions of ways in which countries can influence the actions of other countries in their favor or in their disfavor, to arouse opposition and so on. And I think that this idea really is much more relevant than some idea of primacy based on military power, geographical position that I think just will get us into trouble. And it's curious that Hugh White resorted to this idea of primacy rather than smart power, because smart power by its nature is inherently shareable. It can, in fact, grow and be enjoyed by more people, and is not necessarily a fixed amount of power, which then has to be divvied up in a zero-sum game. My gain is your loss is my gain. Because I think I think Hugh does seek the objective that we all seek, which is a peaceful and prosperous and socially developing East Asia. And I think the understanding of the soft power dimensions of our interactions will allow us to have a notion in which a future in which that can become true. Now, the second major gap in this thesis of thinking of the world in sort of Bismarckian 18th century billiard ball terms is that it fails to account for what I think is probably the single most important development in this region, which is China's internal political development. In the book, it's skipped over far too briefly, but I believe that it really is the most important factor that will determine how this region moves forward. Now, just this past weekend, I spent a couple of days at the Australia Davos connection, and there were Chinese representatives there, and one of them, quite distinguished, well-connected Chinese, said that China would be a democracy in 20 years. If that happens, that changes everything. That really fundamentally changes everything. It changes the possible solutions to relationship between China and Taiwan, the single biggest sticking point between the United States and China. It certainly changes China-Japan relations, and most of all, it changes China-US relations, and I think it would also affect China-Australia relations. We in the United States, and I think to a certain extent you in Australia, judge countries by the way they treat their own citizens. If China establishes rule of law, representative government, checks and balances on internal power, then neither the US nor most other Asian countries will fear its growing influence as they do now. On the other hand, if China continues to oppress minorities and dissidents, censor its media, perpetuate corrupt one-party rule, then the US and China's neighbors will resist its growing hard power based on their judgment of the way it operates internally. So this question of how China will develop, I think, is at the heart of how the region will develop. And it's something that is primarily China's to work out. And we all have various friends and acquaintances from China who give us different views of this, of the possibilities of this. And I think it's what we must be watching and what we must most try to influence. We must not fall on the two extreme sides of this question, which is, number one, to assume that China will develop into an aggressive, bullying, powerful country that we need to oppose right now, because better oppose sooner rather than later. On the other hand, we must not assume that China will inevitably develop into a democratic, rule of law, representative type of government as it becomes more wealthy and more economically affluent. We need to engage with China across the board in order to both understand and try to influence as best we can the more positive developments which would be good for China and good for the region. So I think that if we think in terms of the smart policy as approach to smart power, we will realize the various dimensions in which we interact in this region, both bilaterally with China and multilaterally, in terms of many different forms of engagement. And I think it would lead us not to make some sort of choice right now that the United States and Australia need to make a decision right now as to which way China will go and act on that estimate of the future. But rather, we should have a smart power approach to engaging China across the board in the many different areas of power which actually make a difference to the way things happen here in East Asia. We can't neglect the military side. On the military side, I think that the United States will and should continue to increase its power in order to make military aggression as unattractive to China in the future as it has been in the past. And I think that this is part of what we're seeing in the recently announced American rebalancing towards Asia, which was announced here in Australia, this announcement that there will be Marines training here in Australia, up in the north. I would not concentrate on the individual pieces of what the United States is doing and some of these suggestions from think tanks on carrier battle groups in Perth and Marines defending sea lanes, I think are red herrings. I think the point is that the overall shape of and capability of American military power in this region needs to increase to offset the growing Chinese power. And I think that the United States has a track record of 50 years of use of military power, which has been pretty responsible, pretty accepted, pretty trusted by all of the countries in the region, and many countries in the region have benefited from it, including China. So the military dimension can't be neglected. On the positive military side, I think that the region should work towards military operations towards common interests, whether they be maritime security, humanitarian relief, peacekeeping, and these should very much include China. And we see some encouraging signs. China has deployed for the last couple of years 2 ships and 2 warships and a supply ship to the Gulf of Aden, where there's an international naval coalition which is providing protection against the pirates working out of Somalia, against shipping there. And China is, in fact, increasing the number of peacekeepers it is deploying around the world. And I believe that these sort of cooperative measures in which we use our military forces for common objectives that we all share is an important part of this military development also. I think that the cooperation on the business, the economic side, the financial side, trade side needs to continue. And certainly if there's an area in which there can be any question about whether the United States and the other traditionally powerful countries in this area are willing to share power with China, the answer is yes. The G7, G8, which did not include China originally, now includes China as part of the G20. There are intense, both government-to-government and private business and economic negotiations, deals being cut between the two countries, and this should certainly continue. There should be continued pursuit of common objectives on regional issues, whether they be North Korea, Iran, the South China Sea, Syria, Pakistan, and the work between China and the United States and the work with other countries should be on the basis of understanding everybody's position and coming up with the approaches that they can all support. There's been a group of 6 countries working on North Korea that includes China, the United States, many other countries in which this is exactly taken place. A lot of comparison of the way each country thinks about North Korea, some common action on what to do about it. We have seen in Iran a lot of dialogue about how to handle that, and although the United States has a different point of view about how much economic pressure should be applied to Iran, we talk about it with China. They apply some. We hear them out on why they think it's not going to work. So this cooperation on regional objectives on the basis of everybody participating and then getting something done ought to continue. And we need to, and I think this is very important, work to develop a set of common understandings on international rule of law issues. And I'm thinking about things like international property rights, how companies have a right to what they develop for the world. Mutual restraint in space, in cyberspace, areas in which you should think of them as global commons that everybody can use for their own purposes, that should not be used against the the other side. And we can pursue a set of understandings at various degrees of formality, either from everything from written treaties down to mutual restraint in those. And that process goes on at many levels with the United States, with China, with the many other countries that are involved. And then increasingly, we should make common cause on the transcendent issues that may make some of the piddling little disputes over a godforsaken block of coral in the South China Sea look pretty miserable. And I'm talking about global climate change, water issues, pandemics, threats across the world. And again, the early steps that we're taking on these measures are relative baby steps, and we're thinking in terms of who's going to make exactly an equal contribution to this one, and am I being taken advantage of that one? And I think over time we need to get beyond that to realize that we all have to make certain sacrifices. We all have to contribute if we are to solve these things, which are going to either hurt us all if we don't deal with them, or can help us if we do deal with them. And I think we need continued dialogue on some of these more basic concepts of governance, democracy, rule of law, corruption, human rights. And the objective of those is not to undermine China's current regime, but the idea is to influence China's development, to determine what applies to everyone and in what way it applies to different countries, because ultimately it's for China to decide how it will develop, and the way it does develop will have great impact on all of us. So in summary, I think it's certainly way too early to say that it's time to make a decision on China's a threat, China's not a threat. We have to accommodate China. I think we need to continue to work with China across a broad range of issues. And when I say we, I mean the United States, I mean Australia, I mean Japan, I mean Vietnam, I mean Korea, I mean the Philippines, I mean all of the countries in this region. And layered on top of all of these rather large and formal things I'm talking about are, I think, the relations that are on a personal basis, students studying in one another's countries, personal contacts through business, friendship, ties when Chinese immigrate to other countries, and then return to China. All of this, I think, these human relationships, I think, are much stronger and more effective than they can have been in the past. And I think they can give a sense of common destiny, a peaceful and prosperous destiny that will be to our advantage. And so that's what I think is the future of peace and prosperity in East Asia. I say I'm an optimist. I'm buying. I'm bullish. We can make it happen, but it requires a lot of work and a lot of contact on the part of all of us. So thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion.
That was very interesting. Thank you very much. Perhaps next time you visit Australia, it'll be Ambassador Blair.
Right. I hand it to those of you who've been ambassadors, and I know my limitations.
Well, it's just that you were sort of almost warrior in chief, commanding the largest military power that America has and the world has. But yet you see the future so much in accommodating different interests and trying to build mutual understanding. And it's just a little unusual to hear that emphasis from somebody with your background.
Yeah, I'm not sure it is unusual, because those of us who have been involved in military operations, number one, know the cost in terms of the lives and limbs of your sons and daughters. We also know that that they're an awful lot easier to start than they are to finish, and we would hope that our role would be to be part of the background that prevents them from being used, so that others can get to these sort of win-win solutions that that I talk about. But you're right. We don't sit around in uniform hoping that we'll just get a chance to get out there and kill and maim. We really hope that it won't have to happen.
But it's also, if I might say with respect, a little unusual to hear somebody of your stature talking about American military power in terms of smart power rather than hard power. Is this a move away from the sort of the doctrine of overwhelming force? And is there a more general recognition now, do you think, those with your background, that overwhelming force is perhaps not as useful a tool now as maybe it once was?
I think it's partly a case of the time phases of any particular issue or area. The the military philosopher that we all read in this part of the world is Sun Tzu, the Chinese military scholar who said that the smartest generals are those who don't have to use their force, but when you do use your force, you ought to use it right. And I have found that in many ways, military force is at its most powerful right up at the time that you start using it, and then you discover its limitations, and that it, except in extreme cases, it often can't do the job alone. And I think we've certainly seen that in most of the uses of military power since, say, World War II. That war was, that was the last class of the isms, colonialism, capitalism, communism, and all, where it really seemed to be a contest for societal survival on both sides, and it led to total war, and that was going to have to be fought out. Since then, use of military force, whether it was the Korean War, the various post-colonial conflicts in Vietnam, seemed to be more part of a political development, in which very many other factors, from the national decisions through the irregular opposition rather than force-on-force operation, the role of the civilian seemed to play a greater and greater thing. There are catchphrases for these things. One that was coined by a British general was a war within the people. That is, it's just an aspect of a greater human set of developments. And I think that's more what we have now, in which war is a component. Military forces are a component. And sometimes, yes, you have to vanquish the other person with military force. But as I think we learned, say, in the second Iraq War, where we did a pretty good job of overwhelming force, that didn't do a pretty good job of solving the total problem that we were trying to solve, which was for Iraq to become a positive contributing member of that region rather than the kind of role it had under Saddam. So yeah, I think we've learned.
Yeah, because I think what you've said is really quite significant, not just in terms of our region, but in terms of this debate that is taking place within the United States at the moment, where a lot of senior Americans do feel that conflicts of recent times have illustrated a limitation on America's capacity to achieve outcomes through force.
Right.
And there's obviously there are divided views on that within the United States, but do you think your view is that which is prevailing? Do your old mates in the military share your views?
I think so. I mean, even take a war, probably the most dangerous war in this part of the world would be, and that one that we worry about, is a war over Taiwan, in which China decided to enforce its sovereignty that it claims over Taiwan by military force, and the United States resisted. In the way of thinking of most Americans, that is not a total war between the United States and China. That's not a march to Beijing, a march to Washington, an escalation to nuclear weapons. That still is a fairly confined, both in in geographic and in political terms, kind of a war, and it will only be deterred or solved should it actually take place by other means than military means. There'll be a component of it, a very important component. And I think that's what most people who think deeply about these things believe.
Yeah, I'll just ask one more question, and we'll go to the audience. But I'm still a little puzzled why, if the region, I don't suppose you said it's benign, but you certainly painted a picture of it being stable, and China, I think, more focused on its, building its nation than other things. Why, in those circumstances, you make a decision to realign your forces so you have even greater force in this part of the world rather than elsewhere, particularly when some of us see the elsewhere as really being quite unstable?
Right. I think it has to do with, I know it has to do with the Chinese military buildup, which began about 15 years ago and has resulted in a lot more Chinese capability than existed heretofore. And if the United States and the countries in the region did not respond by themselves becoming more powerful, a military imbalance would result, and that imbalance would result in a temptation to use military power. And I think the objective is to make the use of military power pretty unattractive from the point of view of China or other countries with aggressive ideas, North Korea and so on. And therefore, to turn the attempt for influence and to try to get other countries to do what you want to do to the use of these other means of this so-called smart power. So I think when you think through seriously military conflicts happening in this part of the world, it's difficult to see that they achieve decisive results for one country or not. There's a lot of damage on all sides. The effects on them. The effects of them are, in many cases, unpredictable and potentially pretty bad for all countries concerned. And I think if countries think seriously about those, then they say, well, let's try something else. Let's do it. And this is against the backdrop of the tremendous increase in well-being by all measures in this part of the world. I mean, I give China huge points for pulling 300 million people out of poverty, and now they live in decent housing. They're not worried about where their next meal is coming from as their overwhelming need. Throughout the region, levels of well-being have increased remarkably, and so the question is, why would you want to screw this up, especially when China has another 500 million that still are below this level of a decent well-being, when there are many other social and economic challenges in the part of the world. So I think the idea is to keep the trends that have served all the countries in the world, countries in the region so well in the past going, and not allow military imbalances to interfere with them.
Okay, well, leads to many other questions. I'll take the first one on the right.
Chris Skinner. Admiral, you're a member of
Good idea. Could you just, name's a good start, but just tell us where you fit in.
30 years in the Australian Navy, now a visiting lecturer at the Sydney University, and a humble engineer. You are a member of the Energy Security Leadership, I believe, or have been within the USA. There's another book that I draw to your attention, published this year, called The Kingdom and the Quarry by David Uren, a noted Australian journalist. And the final chapter of that says the most worrying thing about China is its increasing reliance on energy imports. Whereas, on the other hand, the USA is becoming less dependent upon energy imports. So, taking your other final point that military force is only part of a broader context of force and power that can be applied, how would the USA avoid the temptation in the scenario about Taiwan to restrict energy into China and hence force China into a feeling of extremists, which after all was what led Japan to attack Pearl Harbor?
Right. I think the restraining influences would be precisely what you described, is that there would be a strong tendency on both sides, once that very, I think, low probability and difficult situation broke out, to try to end the conflict, not to seek long-term escalation, whether it be in the level of warfare with nuclear weapons or the geographical expansion or the expansion to other sectors, like interfering with the other person's energy or cyber attacks on the other person's, on the other country's control systems, which would knock out power grids and all of those things. So I think what would operate in that case would be the normal ideas that neither side gains by escalating this conflict to a wider level, of which that would be one instance. And before any sort of conflict like that started, the big issue on energy that we both face, of course, is what the energy growth is doing to the environment. And again, it will, if you believe half of what the best scientists tell us, it can make the consequences of either winning or losing a war pretty two-bit in comparison to what might happen from the sort of extremes of weather and heating and flooding of coastal zones that might well happen unless we do a better job on controlling carbon dioxide. So I think the main danger in the case of a U.S. Sino-U.S. conflict is the traditional problem of once you start one of these things, nobody wants to be seen to lose it for internal political reasons, and therefore you escalate something well above what either side intended in the beginning. This dynamic of avoiding feeling weak, of thinking that escalation might be something that would gain you an advantage. That is, I think, the danger of even starting one of these things at all. And we've seen that play out in everything from Cuban Missile Crisis back in '62. A lot of the reason that the United States persisted in Vietnam long after we recognized that we had picked up the wrong end of the stick there was that no president wanted to appear to be to have lost it. And that is a strong and powerful dynamic. And when you have a tool lying around like oil, it can do it. But I think you have to rely on the leaders of the countries being able to think about ways to get off of that corkscrewing, escalating way in ways that both save face and allow returns to peaceful conditions on both sides.
But I think that we all would understand that China would be very unhappy if the West refused to trade its natural resources, support the Chinese development.
Mm-hmm.
But what some of us don't understand is why then is it legitimate for China to refuse to trade its rare earths when the West is badly in need of some of those
right.
products. There's a feeling by some that there seems to be, it's not the same set of rules for both sides.
Exactly right. Well, it's partly a case of scale. I think cutting off a country's oil, I agree with my Navy comrade here that energy is such a big and important thing that threatens national survival in a big way. China has been quite aggressive about economic coercion in key things, whether it was refusing to import Norwegian salmon after the Nobel Prize was awarded to a dissident, to putting cutting off travel from the Philippines after the incident on Fiery Cross Reef to the one that you mentioned of after this dispute in the Senkakus, cutting off rare earths. Those generally turn out to be two-edged swords when you follow them through. I think the result of cutting off rare earths is going to be the establishment of a much more global rare earth industry in which China will have competitors in an area which it had previously had a 99% monopoly. It's difficult on a unilateral basis to use economic sanctions to achieve major political gains, and I think China is learning that.
So it's probably a bit offensive to say this to the Middle Kingdom, but do you think it illustrates some immaturity in the use of the other techniques of international relations?
I do, and I think there's immaturity on the other side too, in that thinking that largesse of aid will give you political leverage. The United States has a rich and long history of providing huge amounts of aid to countries and then them turning around and saying, thanks very much, would you leave, please? And I think China will find the same thing. I see elements of that, for instance, in Myanmar, where there were clear Chinese economic interests in putting this dam up on the rivers in northern Myanmar. I'm sure behind the scenes, this is not informed by intelligence or anything else, but I'm sure there's heavy pressure behind the scenes on this new Myanmar government to let the thing go forward. But the protests of the local citizens there were determinative, and the big Chinese company that was going to do that job was told to go packing.
Yeah.
I think there are just limits to this coercive use of trade relations or of financial relations that until you get to these things like total war, cut off of all imports, blockades, those sorts of scenarios.
Yeah, I think there's a few examples starting to occur in Africa. Let's go right up to the back row.
Hello, George Papadikla is my name, just a member of the public. Just wanted to follow on.
It's very good. Members of the public drop into
we
our
are allowed
lectures.
in the universities, I believe. I just wanted to follow on in a way from what you were discussing there about buying influence around the Pacific. Now, we've got the situation where North Korea is still seen as a preferred buffer state by the Chinese hierarchy. But then you have, in the various areas of the South Pacific, we see Chinese influence starting to be bought and paid for, so to speak, in some of the smaller Pacific islands. And we could sort of theoretically speculate in places like maybe Papua New Guinea and even places like Indonesia and the Philippines, there could be more of a battle of the dollar and the renminbi or the one in terms of buying influence. So I just wanted to ask you if you could expand on how long you thought North Korea can be seen as a useful buffer state for China. Is there any kind of end game in their thinking that's on the horizon? And how then would North Korea then be absorbed when we think of South Korea? And in terms of the South Pacific, how do you see that playing out, particularly in terms of the increasing military presence that you alluded to of American troops on Australian soil, and the possibility, as we speculated by some American think tanks, of placing actual bases in places like Perth? And if I can just add one little coda, the possibility of Antarctica being a battleground for resources, because I think resources is going to be the key influence in driving these contentious power plays.
Right, that's a lot of questions.
Well, it's really, I think the key part of it, with respect, is the use of buying influence. How does that fit into the whole smart power debate, and how does it fit into the power balance within the Pacific?
Right. My experience over many years is that people who you thought you'd bought don't tend to stay bought over time, and when that clashes with really more fundamental interests in terms of their internal power positions or what they think they need to do for political reasons, the old bribes don't really do it. So I'm not completely relaxed, but I'm fairly relaxed about pouring inordinate amounts of money on very small countries and expecting them to dance to your tune. As I say, the United States has had quite a bit of experience in the Cold War years of thinking people who we had pretty well supplied and taken care of, and darn it, they turned around and acted against us. On North Korea, I would take a somewhat different view. I think China's primary motivation with North Korea is not so much a buffer state between them and the American troops in South Korea as it is an insurance policy against instability in that country, which they think would result in flows of refugees across the Yalu into China, civil war, and something up to perhaps a serious situation right on their border, with all of the headaches that would cause. So I think that's their primary motivation, and the reason that they are supporting North Korea in the way that they are. At the same time, they are trying to convince North Korea to liberalize certainly its economic policy along the model that China took. I'm not in the room when China invites the president of Korea and other seniors into their country and say, see, you can have nice, tight political control and you can have economic development too. We did it. Why don't you do the same thing? I think that's pretty much what the conversation takes place, and the North Koreans say, thank you very much. I think I know how to do this thing better than you do, and we'll continue doing it our way. So
I don't think
I
they would say better than you do, would they?
What's that?
Would they say better than you do?
Well, I think they say we know how to do it in our country better than you're recommending that we do it.
Okay, another question right up the back also.
Admiral, first of all, can I say thank you very much.
Just name.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Nick Adams. I'm just an interested member of the public. Admiral, first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for your service and the commitment of you and your military and your countries to freedom for everyone all around the world. If you pick up a newspaper or you listen to the radio or you turn on the television, we're constantly told here in Australia that we're living in the Asian century, that America's time has passed, and that really it's China and Asia that we should be interested in and focused on, because that's where the future lies. I'd like to get your take on that. I know that there's various ways of looking at it, but certainly I would have thought from my analysis of the situation, China's power really derives from its population and size. It appears that when it comes to things such as innovation and those matters, that America is still streaks ahead. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to say in my earlier remarks, that there are many dimensions of the development of the East Asian region, and to hang a label on it with one country, American, Chinese, and all, is a American or Chinese or any other label, is a real misrepresentation of what really goes on. I think the Asia that we seek will have products made in many countries, will have ideas that have been developed in many other different countries. It will have free flow of people around the region working on common projects. So I see a much more mixed picture in which it has a label like Asia on it, not a label like America or China on it.
Well, we'll look for another question. Many countries in the region, including us, have benefited from the investment of the huge investment by the US people in stability and security in the Asia-Pacific region. Are the American people tiring of that? Is there any sense that they feel that the rest of us ought to pay more?
I think so far the American attitude has pretty much been, the Cold War has been over for 20 years now, and I think the American general feeling is that We benefit a great deal from our interaction with Asia, and we don't mind paying a little bit extra in order for that to exist. And I think that's really what we should be looking for in Chinese behavior. Right now, China is not a free rider in that sense of the term, but it doesn't think in terms of what is the greater good of this part of the world, of which we can benefit partly, but we do have to contribute as a big member of it in parts that won't directly benefit our country. I think the best characterization of the American role in all of this was by Lee Kuan Yew, whom we, one of the great figures of this part of the world. He wrote a 2-volume set of memoirs, and if you read the chapter on the United States, I could summarize it this way. It basically says that, if you have to have a superpower as the most powerful country in your region, the United States is probably better than most. And that's sort of high praise from Lee Kuan Yew, if any of you have
Well, Singapore's
talked to
gained
him.
greatly from it as well, haven't
But
they?
what he's basically saying is that the United States
You don't ask too much.
basically sort of keeps out of the way, takes advantage of trade relations, and is basically sort of well-meaning and doesn't keep exact score on are we, getting one more erg of benefit to the United States from this action. We tend to think in a little bit wider terms, and I think that when China is seen to be acting in that same way, then the many countries in the region will be happy to have China assume a greater role. But right now, you hear things from China in the South China Sea like, we're not going to deal in a multilateral context. We want to deal bilaterally, just with the Philippines, just with Vietnam. And the reason they're saying that, of course, is that it's to their advantage, because in each bilateral relationship, they're the big guy, the other country is a little guy, and that attitude has to change for the region to feel that Chinese leadership would be a good thing. I think right now, Chinese leadership is seen as a thing that we sort of have to deal with, but it's a little bit scary. I talked about domestic developments in China, but the external manifestation of this is this willingness to contribute to the greater good and not to keep exact unilateral score on everything. And I don't think the United States is tired of playing in that game.
Mm-hmm.
It's still characteristic of the way we approach it.
Another question? Yep.
Good evening, Admiral. My name's Tor Larson. I'm a first-year student here. America also has quite a lot of bilateral relations, trade relationships with smaller countries too, doesn't it?
Right, and we're trying to expand many of those into multilateral things with various initiatives. Conventional wisdom in the United States is that there are too few multilateral fora here, and we'd like to have more.
Good. Look, the question I wanted to ask was, it was good to hear that a Chinese official thought they might become democratic in 20 years.
I thought so too.
I gather another official...
Don't know that he'd want it repeated here, though. Help him when he gets home.
Another Chinese official apparently said that one of China's biggest concerns, probably within the next 20 years, will be food security. And
right.
that internal drive might sort of force China, regardless of their politics and other issues, to be more expansionist. Do you think that's a possibility?
No, I take that differently. I think one of the things the region has going for it in terms of China's development is, right now, when you look at China and deal with the Chinese a lot, there's quite a contrast between their external confidence and image, which is aggressive, reaching out in the South China Sea, setting the pace in Taiwan, brushing up against Japan. It seems like a real juggernaut that's, as you go in China and talk with Chinese officials who are involved in internal matters, it's a tremendous concern about internal stability. 170,000 documented riots a year, 250 million workers who don't have a place to sleep at night. So there's a tremendous contrast, I think, between China's internal concern about how do you handle this huge number of people that you're trying to bring out of poverty and foster social development, and this sort of external 10% GDP growth, lots of submarines and all of that. And I think that my experience is that when you are worried about your internal situation, you tend to be a little more modest externally. You don't think that you can solve your situation by external aggression. In my memory, I can recall just one country that tried that, and that was Argentina with the Falklands War. It turns out in retrospect, it was a fairly half-hearted attempt, and it led to disaster. The government left. I think that, and if you look at official Chinese policy, and I think this last couple of years has been very indicative in this regard. The sort of the height of the Chinese attempt to have their way in the South China Sea was in the ASEAN foreign minister, or the ARF Foreign Ministers Conference about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now, in Vietnam, and that was when the Chinese foreign minister lectured the assembly of the countries, reminded them that China was a big country, they were small countries, and they just had to adjust to that. The snapback from those countries and many others in terms of their relations with China, they're reaching out to the United States, they're reaching out to each other, was so strong that the Chinese leadership obviously had a meeting and said, well, that didn't work very well. We managed to unite everybody against us. Let's go back to principle number one. And principle number one in Chinese foreign policy is that in order for China to develop internally, which is the most important imperative, they need an external environment which is pretty quiet, so that trade, foreign investment, all of those things can get. And none of that is helped by stirring up tensions, much less having a war, as we discussed, with the rest of the world. So I think that is also sets a sort of upper limit on the way that China wants to stir up the world and recover Middle Kingdom status. Although I don't hear people in China talking in those terms. So I think that's operating to China's benefit and to everybody else's benefit, and I don't really see a lashing out in order to compensate for internal concerns.
Further questions? Yep.
Alex Caritas, another member of the public. How do you
Anybody here go to school?
Yeah, I'm a little,
okay. We had one student there. Okay, yeah.
We don't normally have people wandering past here. Okay.
Well, very interested member of the public. How do you see, I really like this concept of China developing into a democracy in, say, 20 years. How do you see that coming about, given the current status of current political status?
Yeah, they when you talk to Chinese about that, they point to a couple of things. One thing is that you hear most often is this bottom-up idea, the idea that there are in fact elections in villages, and once we learn how to do it in a village, we'll learn how to do it in a province, and so on and up. And I've been hearing that for quite a number of years without a whole lot of progress on it. When you think of the sort of top-down imposed ways, that's sort of an oxymoron, is it? I'm going to impose democracy on myself by authoritarian and means. We're going to measure it. We're going to know just how well we are. But I can see, and there are some Chinese thinkers who are trying to sort this out in terms of elections and so on. And I think the Chinese are sophisticated to realize that democracy is not just holding an election. In fact, we've seen many countries in the world in which, one man, one vote, one time has been pretty much the model. And then once you're in power through an election, you then use your power position to reward your friends and to make sure there's never another election again. And so the Chinese have seen that as well. So I think that the dilemma you point to is a real one for China. But in addition to this democracy reflecting the universal human aspiration to want to control your destiny, I think they understand that they need to work on rule of law, having a court system that is not controlled by the party, not just it being set by the party, opening up the media in a freer way to shine a light on some of these areas of corruption and all. So I think that you could see some of the constituent elements of a democracy being developed, and then maybe tentative electoral politics. There are token other parties besides the Communist Party in China. They could expand. So you could see how it could be done if there were a will to do it. On the subject of a will to do it, I had a fascinating conversation with a Chinese researcher who, about two years ago, or about a year and a half ago, was talking about the contrast between the demonstrations in Tahrir Square, which led to the overthrow of longtime dictator Mubarak, and the almost contemporary, I think they were off by a month or two, pretty serious riots in the United Kingdom, in London, in many of the other middle cities, and that resulted in a royal commission and no real perturbation of the government. And they're thinking, urban riot in a democracy, royal commission, urban riot in an autocracy, government overthrown. We're going to become a very urban country here over time. Which of these two choices is best? So I think that, and part of what I hear from Chinese, which is interesting, is that is their concept of democracy. In many cases, they think, as I just described, what's the best way to get economic development? That's how you judge a form of government. Definition of democracy by one Chinese I heard is expressing the will of the majority while safeguarding the rights of the minority. And democracy is a heck of a lot more than either one of those definitions. It has to do with individual self-development potential, with being left alone by your government and fulfilling your equality of opportunity. All of those things which are sort of bound into the way democracy has developed over the years in countries that have sort of been hit by it over the centuries, from the United States and then many other countries, people who don't have white skins these days. And so I think that the understanding of what democracy really is limited in China, but nonetheless there are some fairly utilitarian advantages that they see, and they're thinking it through. And I think they're very practical people in the end, and I really hope they do think it through the right way.
Time for a couple more. Yep.
Thanks very much, Admiral Blair. Dominic Ma from the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University and Director of the Australia-Chinese Dialogue. I'm in Sydney at the moment, but I've been in Canberra for most of the last 6 years. All right. My question relates to essentially citizen diplomacy or people-to-people relations between the US and China. And right now, obviously, election season in the US, it's kind of open season on blaming China for various things.
Right.
And it seems to never sort of go away, and in fact becoming much worse. And with China's economy effectively scheduled to become bigger than the US economy in 8 or 15 years, depending on what happens, it seems likely to be getting worse over time. President Obama obviously has done a lot to counteract this kind of trend with I think it's called Project Pengyo. He's got a program, or he sponsors a program to send 10,000 American students to China. But it doesn't seem to be quite having the impact that it needs to, and the public discourse in China, in the US especially during the election season, is very anti-China. Do you see any chance of this not becoming worse over the next decade? And what do you think can happen? What do you think can be done to make it better?
I think I would have a little bit different assessment than you do of the trend in recent years. I actually think that the things that are being said about the U.S.-China relationship are milder this time around than we've seen in the past. For instance, in 1992, we had the butchers of Beijing, and that really incendiary phrase, which then when President Clinton, who uttered it, became president, he had to spend a long time eating it before he could have relations. Things were relatively restrained in 2000, and I think what Governor Romney has said, that I will label China a currency manipulator on the second day of my administration, which is about the most inflammatory thing he has said. Okay, that's not war. That's that's a fairly esoteric economic move, which may or may not work in the opinion of most economists. So I don't think it's quite as bad as you are saying. I do think that the less said about foreign relations, the better. And I know from having talked to people who've worked in campaigns that, and in fact, the general commentary in the United States is that there really isn't much difference between the Romney campaign and what the Obama campaign has been doing, but they're desperately trying to find ways to make it seem better. And so I think you have to take some of that. So I'm not quite as worried as you are, but that being said, we do have parts of both countries in which there are articles being written, speeches being given, which do cast the intentions of the other country and the capabilities in really lurid terms. They then are picked up by the extreme in that other country, said, aha, see? And then they write an article which is even more suspicious and frightened and bloodthirsty, and then that feeds back. When I was in Washington a couple of years ago, a researcher from the Communist Party school in Beijing, which is the place that you have to go if you want to become a senior communist official, came by and talked to me and said, okay, I've been here in the United States for 6 weeks now, and I really understand the United States. Here's what you all really believe. And he put on my desk a series of 6 or 8 articles that were really anti-Chinese in their way. And I said, and I follow the press pretty closely in my country about China in particular. It's on my RSS feed. And I said, I've never heard of these guys. Who are they? These are obscure academics in 2-bit think tanks that write this stuff. Don't take that for what America thinks about it. On the same side, when I visited China, there was an article, 7 or 8 years ago, called "Total War with the United States," which was written by 2 senior Chinese colonels, which talked about, here's the deal. If there's a war over Taiwan, the United States is more powerful at the conventional phase than is China, and therefore we have to resort to all means of warfare in order to defeat them. Chemicals, biological weapons, cyber attacks, and so on. So I went and I said, I'd like to meet these 2 senior colonels who are writing this stuff, because this is getting played back in the American press. It's getting out of way. So I met them, and I said, why did you write that? And they said, well, it sells. and I don't.
I didn't know Hugh White was a colonel.
I think they were being honest, but I think this is bad, and you need the experts who study and the person-to-person contact to put this in context and not allow it to dominate our relationship.
Okay, one more up the back, and I think we might start drawing to a close and give the Admiral a break.
Okay, sure. Hello, I'm Sonia Thompson. I'm a postgraduate student here at the university. I just wanted to ask a question about the possibility for ethnic conflict within China, if the US government is concerned that that's a fear within the next 20 to 30 years, and what impact that would then have on the relationship between the US and China, depending on how those ethnic conflicts played out.
You're talking about Tibet or Xinjiang or some of the ethnic conflicts there. I think that, yeah.
Sorry, I'm also saying that depending on how that played out, there might be pressure within the US from the public for the US to take a side or...
Right. I think if there were, and this is, it's already the case, when something happens in China involving oppression by the Chinese government of a minority or another, whether I mean from Tiananmen Square back through Tibetan monks burning themselves and so on, you see a tremendous amount of outrage and anger and public statements, and generally the form that it takes is economic sanctions, cutting off ties, that sort of thing. And you know, within the range of what one would think about a future, I think that process would continue. If you saw China being ripped apart by a full-scale secessionist movement of a minority, that might be something else. But I think I think that the other would be more likely, and it would be a longer-term game.
In concluding, I just want to draw you back to the smart power, and particularly how that might be relevant to the Australia-US relationship.
Right.
I was taken what you said a moment ago about China trying to build these bilateral relations because that's the way it feels it's got an advantage. Until recently anyway, we saw a lot of that from the United States in this region through the old hub and spokes principle. Right. The US actually preferred to deal bilaterally with the states of the region and wasn't too keen on sort of collective approaches. If the US, if this does develop as a trend where the US starts to focus more upon use of its military as a component in smart power rather than just hard power, how's it going to affect how it relates to this region as a whole? You know, is it going to be going to seek the goal in the terms of this question we put to you tonight of peace and stability through a multilateral relationship in the region in a way that it hasn't in the past? And how's that going to affect the Australian-US alliance and general strategic relationship?
Right. I think this idea that the United States prefers to be the spider in the middle of the web and to tickle the different strands is a little bit outdated. In fact, the United States has been promoting its allies to work together in larger coalitions. I saw an article in the paper over the weekend that the largest Navy exercise, which is hosted by the United States, the so-called RIMPAC exercise, included I think it was 20 different countries. So I think we are trying to include more. And in fact, the general reaction in the United States was when the military logistics agreement between Japan and Korea blew up because of political outrage in Korea after it had been negotiated by military authorities. We were against that. We think that other countries should work with each other. So I think I think the hub and spoke has been really overlaid with more of a network, which is the way the United States really prefers to work now. And in fact, in many areas, the United States tries to involve China in this activity for those missions I mentioned, humanitarian response, peacekeeping, and so on, in order simply to develop habits of cooperation, which maybe could put into context these war plans that we have that involve going against the other country. So I think that the United States is moving that direction. I think whether the United States wills it or not, the countries of the region are willing that, and I would and do encourage Australia to develop its military relations with many other countries. And the practical fact of the matter is, it's not a Hobbesian choice. You can do both. You can have multilateral relations. You can keep bilateral relations. And in fact, when you're involved in, well, when Admiral Barry and I were in, and it was Australia in the lead, with the United States doing some support, not including troops on the ground. The East Timor operation, we really blended the bilateral capabilities that we had with Australia with the multilateral setup that Australia set up. So, in fact, you can do both. You should do both, and you shouldn't.
But you're suggesting we should look at the alliance more in a multilateral context than perhaps traditionally has been the case.
I think so, and we should also involve partners who don't happen to be treaty allies, whether they be Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, countries that have an interest in these common forms of security that we're dealing with, and I don't think the United States has any problem with that. We welcome it, in fact.
Okay. Well, I think Admiral Barry was pointed to. Can I just say, in passing, to have a former Chief of the Defence Force of Australia here tonight, it's also an honour for us. Chris, thanks for hosting Admiral Blair. And Admiral, thank you very much for joining with us tonight and engaging so openly and really, I think, providing a very interesting dialogue and some views that we haven't always heard from distinguished military officers of your standing. I also, somebody very kindly up the back recognised the enormous service that you've given to your country. We recognise that, and we gave you an Australian honour because we recognise that through that service you've also done great service for us. So thank you very much, and thanks for coming along tonight.
Thanks very much, Robert. Enjoyed it.